This is a conversation with a cognitive neuroscientist who's going to teach us how to improve our brains so that we can perform better within the game. Now, Glen is obviously a cognitive neuroscientist, but he's also the scientific director for a company called Myndlift. Now, Myndlift is a company that's basically bringing neurofeedback out of the clinics and into the hands of the average person. It's making it a lot more accessible. Now, what is neurofeedback? I'm glad you asked, because that's exactly what we're going to cover in this conversation. We talk about what neurofeedback is, how it works, and kind of dig into the nitty-gritty of the neuroscience behind it, as well as the research that's involved, both the good and the bad research, which I think is important to understand. Now, for anyone who knows a little bit about me personally, I'm a big experimenter. I like to, this is a headset that's supposed to zap my brain. This is the Myndlift EEG device. Got a closet full of nootropics over there. Got a bunch of wires and stuff that's also going to zap my brain. Nonetheless, you get the point. So when it comes to the idea of experimenting with my brain, that stuff excites me. And I like to do a lot of different experimentation. But when it comes to neurofeedback specifically, I think it is the most important thing for us to understand. If I were to recommend one thing to people, I would recommend neurofeedback. It's safe, it's effective, there's a ton of research behind it, and quite honestly, I think it's about to become the standard of esports. The fact that people aren't actively training their brains with it right now, that we know of at least, is kind of mind-blowing. So I hope you guys learn a ton in this conversation. I hope you absolutely enjoy it. And if you do, then don't forget to comment and like and all that fun stuff. That all set up. How's your day been?
Good. Lots of exciting stuff, at Myndlift. We can talk about it.
Yeah, for sure. Like I obviously had sent you a full list of questions that I'm curious to kind of ask about. But before kind of kicking that off, I'd be just curious to hear about you and your career and how you ended up, maybe the origin story of how you got involved with Myndlift in the first place.
Well, I'm a cognitive psychologist, cognitive neuroscientist, and I did my doctoral work at NYU. Finished it in around 2000, 2001. My work related to visual perception and object recognition from partial information using ERP, event-related potentials.
Yeah.
Then in 2003, I left academia, joined industry, went to work for a startup in the computerized cognitive assessment space, and was their director of scientific development for 17 years.
Wow.
And yeah, I'm still working for them part-time. And when I started there were no peer-reviewed publications on the system. Today, there are more than 200 in the peer-reviewed scientific literature.
Nice.
So the product was developed and validated in many different conditions over the last 17 years. And then I started getting interested in doing something different. And Myndlift was looking for a scientific director. This was about a year and a half ago. So it was a good fit. They're sort of where my other company was 17 years ago. We don't yet have any peer-reviewed publications in the scientific literature. Mm-hmm. And this time it's intervention as compared to assessment, although Myndlift is also doing assessment, yep, as we can talk about later. Yep. And I was able to go back to my long lost love, for EEG. And when I was doing my doctoral work, I just thought to myself, wow, if this could be made more practical, and the participant or the client, it doesn't have to sit in at that time in an electrically shielded room, with an electro cap on with many electrodes, and have to sit through filling the electrodes with a syringe and gel and whatnot. And this would be somehow, practical. That would be so much better than what I was doing then. And sure enough, now the technology has advanced. Everybody's got a mobile device, Bluetooth technology.
Yep.
And with headsets like the Muse headset, it is possible to do a very good EEG recording, with a consumer device.
Yeah.
And so I thought, wow, this is great. And so here I am. And for over the last year and a half since I started, I've been working on, getting some evidence-based research studies going, using Myndlift. I've been working on, the scientific integrity of the product.
Mm-hmm.
Making sure that everything looks stable, signal looks good, and so on.
Yep.
And thinking about features that we can add to Myndlift that would enhance clinical utility, and also serve the scientific integrity goal. So yeah, that's in a nutshell.
So like I'm also just curious, this is more of just a side question, but when you were in school, did you kind of envision like this is where you'd kind of want the direction for your career to be, or were you like originally thinking more academic pursuits, or like what inspired you to make each of those steps, I guess?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, at the beginning, I was thinking that I would make a career in academia, because that's usually what PhDs do. But despite my naivete, and thinking that, well, in the ivory tower of academia, things are more pleasant and less competitive. That wasn't the case. I discovered that wasn't the case, and I said, okay, well, and also industry is or can be more lucrative than academia.
Mm-hmm.
So that was certainly a consideration for me. But yeah, I've before I joined Myndlift, I actually did a stint in academia.
Okay.
I worked at a Sheba Medical Center in actually virtual reality, in the context of early detection and intervention for Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, wow.
So I started to get, I started to get kind of interested in returning to academia, and did that for a few years actually, in parallel with my computerized cognitive assessment job in industry.
Okay.
And then when I joined Myndlift, I decided, this is really, what I want to dive into. And the other stuff, I'm still actually writing papers, related to the virtual reality stuff, but
Wow.
this is where I really want to, invest my energies now. So yeah.
That sounds really interesting. How would one use virtual reality in that context?
Well, the idea was, could we ward off cognitive decline in healthy middle-aged individuals who are at high risk for Alzheimer's disease?
Mm.
So these are children of Alzheimer's disease patients, and could we? So the first thing to show is that cognitive cognitive function actually improves differentially when they do a virtual reality type intervention task. So a series of virtual tasks that are ecologically valid, right? Meaning that they reflect, real life activities like walking down the aisle in the supermarket, as opposed to the cognitive training uh, tasks that are generally out there, which are much less ecologically valid, maybe more similar actually to playing a game than they are to actual real world tasks. So the thought was, could we look at the ability of tasks like this that are more ecologically valid to slow down cognitive decline or improve cognitive decline? And we also looked at the contribution of motor function, like the interaction between cognitive function and motor function. So if you take the supermarket example, when you go to the supermarket and you're shopping, you're walking down the aisle, you're actually walking down the aisle. It's not just
Right.
trying to find the right product, which is maybe a more cognitive operation, but it's also kind of walking down the aisle at the same time. And so we tried to mimic that real life situation, and then look at the components. We had different conditions where you can look at the cognitive plus the motor. So we had the participants walk on the treadmill while they were viewing this scene, this virtual scene, doing the cognitive task.
Yeah.
With the treadmill, without the treadmill, with the treadmill, but without the virtual reality, we had all the different combinations.
Okay.
And currently analyzing the data. And we'll just say the jury's out, and there were cognitive outcomes like behavioral outcomes, and there were also brain imaging outcomes. But like I said, this opportunity at Myndlift is, it takes the cake. It's really what I've always dreamed about doing since I was in graduate school. So
that's very cool to hear. That's very cool to hear. And I guess with that makes a good transition into questions about Myndlift. So, like, to be fair, a lot of the audience that will end up watching clips out of this interview or any of it in general, they won't know what Myndlift is. They probably don't know what neurofeedback is, and I'm trying to help introduce that into esports. Obviously, there's a lot of applications for neurofeedback in the clinical setting, but we're very much interested in bringing it to like the performance side of things and introducing it to people who are typically around the ages, maybe say like 18 to 24. And so they, usually they're pretty cognitively healthy individuals, but there's I believe, and I think a lot of people believe, that there's a lot of potential for using something like this to help improve their performance in a setting where they're getting paid for pure cognitive performance. Unlike traditional sports where it's mostly about the body, there's a lot of the mental side to it too, but it's mostly body. Esports is very much just a pure cognitive task. And for a lot of these bigger high-end tournaments, there's millions of dollars on the line. So the idea that neurofeedback as a performance tool is not popular in esports yet just shows the opportunity for it. So I'd really love to kind of slowly introduce it step by step, starting with just like the basics of like what brainwaves are, why brainwaves exist, what they do in our heads, and kind of go from there.
Sure. So I prepared a presentation which I think would be very helpful to share at this point.
Yep.
Okay. So what is EEG, right? EEG is a record of the naturally occurring electrical activity in the brain that we can detect at the scalp. And it should be clear that there are many, many, many neurons, billions of neurons in the brain. And we can't really detect the activity of all of those neurons. We can only detect the activity of certain neurons that are all firing together. They're called pyramidal cells, and they're all oriented in the same way relative to the scalp. And when they do that, we can detect a meaningful shift in activity that dovetails with their firing, or it's really the extracellular currents around them as they fire. And when we record the EEG at the scalp, the electrical activity at the scalp, it's really raw. It kind of just looks like a bunch of squiggles, and we don't really know what we're looking at. But hiding in that raw EEG are a bunch of different oscillations or rhythmic, repetitive patterns of neural activity. And they're different depending upon the frequency of the repetition. So that we have some that are very slow. They may repeat only once or a few times every second, and some that are very fast and repeat much more frequently over that 1 second. And they're called delta, beta, alpha, beta, and gamma. Delta being the slowest and gamma being the fastest. And as we'll see, each one of those corresponds to certain brain processes and certain mental states that are interesting to us because we can modify them using neurofeedback to bring them into a better state. But we'll talk more about that. Okay, so here's a table where you can see, each of those brain waves, or bands as they're called, is generated subcortical brain areas deep within the brain, and some of them are generated by the cortex. which is the large portion of the brain that is directly beneath the skull, and is the most advanced part of the brain that's involved in cognitive function and motor function in the most advanced, sophisticated way as compared to the deeper subcortical areas. And then you can also see kind of a list of the types of things that are associated with each of those brain waves, and they can be things related to sleep, memory, attention, all kinds of different things. So these are the things that we can think about improving with neurofeedback. Okay, so this is just a simplified figure that will help us understand, how are the slower bands different from the faster bands in terms of the overall state of the brain. And it's an oversimplification, but we can say that the slower bands are more associated with a relaxed state, and the faster are a state of alertness or concentration. And it should be clear that kind of the ideal place to be is in the middle. You don't want to be, so relaxed that you're practically sleeping, and you don't want to be hyper aroused so that you may be making errors and things. You want to be somewhere in the middle, and we'll see that indeed the most effective bands to train are going to be the ones in the middle, like the low beta and the alpha. Other things that are different between the slower and the faster have to do with the amplitude of the waves, so how tall the waves are. Generally, the slower waves are taller, they're higher in amplitude compared to the faster waves. And the slower waves are more synchronous, that they fire together, and brain regions are more they're doing things together more in the lower, slower bands as compared to the faster ones. This is another table that can give us a little more granularity, a little more detail with regard to more narrow frequency bands within the larger ones, and it gives us an indication of the very specific types of processes and states that are related to these very narrow bands. Again, all things that we could potentially modify in an adaptive way with neurofeedback. So we talked about EEG, and we've talked about the bands that are hidden, as it were, within the raw EEG, and that they're specialized. And now we're going to talk about neurofeedback, which is our ability to potentially modify our brain activity in a specific way, and functioning in real time. It instantly relays information, that's the feedback, about very small changes through auditory or visual feedback. And the brain naturally seeks more positive feedback and gradually optimizes its activity. And it does this through a process of operant conditioning, which I'll expand on in the next slide. But when you do neurofeedback, it makes your brain more efficient, and it also makes you more aware of your brain state. So operant conditioning is rather old. It actually has its origin in Thorndike's law of effect, which is very simple. Any behavior followed by a pleasant consequence is likely to be repeated. And then B.F. Skinner, father of behavioral psychology, coined the term operant conditioning, in that the learner operates on the environment and receives a reward for certain behaviors or operations. So what happens is, over time, with reinforcement is established. So on the right, if we think about Skinner's experiments with rats, they learned through operant conditioning that every time they pressed a lever, they would receive a food pellet. At the beginning, there was no contingency. There was no relationship between pressing a lever and receiving food. But eventually, over time, they were conditioned to learn that there was a relationship, and they pressed. In the human neurofeedback case, in the example that I've given here, maybe we were increasing our alpha wave amplitude. And every time that we successfully increase that amplitude, we might be able to advance in a game. I mean, a special game, right? That's designed to help us train our brain. Or we might be watching a YouTube video and be able to see it crisply, as opposed to having it fade out on us. Those are things that are incorporated in the Myndlift system. Those are the ways that Myndlift does neurofeedback. Yep, just another schematic to give you a visual idea of how neurofeedback works. We've got sensors or electrodes that are placed on the scalp. In the case of Myndlift, we use the Muse headset. We've got an external USB electrode that plugs into the Muse headset. And one of those electrodes is the training electrode. And that's the spot on the scalp where the brain waves of interest are usually largest and easiest to train. And those electrodes, particularly the training one, are feeding data into our database, and then based on the amplitudes of those waves, we then provide positive feedback or not in the game or the YouTube video that you happen to be watching. And then that is a closed loop. It goes around and around, and over time, just like in the operant conditioning slide that we showed previously, you learn to improve your brain activity, to get those waves into the right zones. Sometimes you'll be enhancing a wave, that is increasing the amplitude of that wave, and sometimes you'll be inhibiting it, that is decreasing the amplitude, depending upon what's adaptive, what's considered a more healthy brain state. And this is about plasticity or neuroplasticity, and the question is, well, does neurofeedback actually change the brain? And the brain is constantly changing, even in older individuals. Neurons that weren't doing a particular task or weren't involved in a particular process previously can learn, so to speak, to do a new process, new activity. But with neurofeedback, there's this great potential to actually cause the brain to make adaptive changes at all levels. Because what neurofeedback is doing is it's taking an internal process, internal state and process, and making it apparent at a conscious level to the trainee. And these brain waves, as we saw previously, are generated at the cellular level, and then they propagate up to the scalp. And there are networks of cells, neurons in this case, that are working together and at all of the various levels, from the single cell to networks, to multiple networks. If you manage to change your brain activity in an adaptive way through neurofeedback, it will affect all of those levels. And that's not the case if you say, were to have some type of a laser-guided surgical procedure. In the case of clinical individuals with clinical conditions, you might compare it to actually, doing such a surgical procedure that perhaps removes a problematic piece of tissue, but that won't change, the brain networks. It will still take time for the brain to recover and ultimately improve in a more global way. But neurofeedback allows your brain to improve globally, just by virtue of the operant conditioning that you're doing. And in fact, it's been shown that when you train a particular brainwave like alpha, or at a particular location on the scalp, the benefits and the changes are not usually limited to that particular location or that particular brainwave, but they tend to be more global, which supports this idea of plasticity at a much more comprehensive level. Brief history of neurofeedback. Richard Caton, back in 1875, discovered the electrical nature of the brain. Hans Berger, German scientist, invented EEG and discovered the alpha wave, which is the largest, most prominent rhythm. That was in the 1920s. And then in the late 1950s, Joe Kamiya demonstrated that individuals could correctly identify when they were producing alpha waves. That was a precursor to neurofeedback. In other words, there was access. We could somehow appreciate what our brain was doing in terms of generating brainwaves. And then Barry Sterman came along, and in the late 1960s, well, actually the earlier 60s and then into the late 60s, looked at a different brainwave, the sensory motor rhythm, or SMR, which oscillates at 12 to 15 hertz, and found that cats could modify their SMR. They could enhance their SMR, increase the size of this brainwave, and that cats and humans with epilepsy could reduce the occurrence of seizures through this neurofeedback process. And then Joel Lubar applied SMR neurofeedback and theta-beta ratio training, which is related to children with ADHD. And to date, the best evidence for neurofeedback is in reducing symptoms of ADHD. And then there are other protocols that have been used besides the alpha and the SMR and theta beta. There's theta alpha training, sometimes known as the Peniston-Golkowski protocol, which was used in addiction, particularly in alcohol addiction, but it's been applied more generally. And we're going to see that in peak performance, that protocol is also relevant. Yeah, so neurofeedback's been around for a while, more than 50 years, and there's a lot of research out there on neurofeedback. But there's still a lot to do. There are some key criticisms of the research that's been done, and here you can see them. One of them has to do with sample size. Very often the samples are small. There are a lot of case studies. Another has to do with the control group or lack thereof. It's ideal if you can have an active control group that you can compare to the neurofeedback group, where what the active control group is doing is as similar to neurofeedback as possible, but it's not neurofeedback, and then show that the neurofeedback has a specific benefit compared to that active control group. But it's not so simple. It's not simple to determine, what that active control group should be. And often people talk about a sham control. That's really what I was describing, something that matches the neurofeedback but isn't actually neurofeedback. So in studies that use a sham, very often, the sham participants will, they'll have the electrodes on. They'll be doing the same neurofeedback task. They'll be they'll train as often as the neurofeedback group, but the positive feedback will not be tied to their changes in their brainwaves, and that's taken to be a very good control. However, folks like Trollinger and colleagues take issue and say, well, that's not really a placebo. That's not in there. There's stuff going on and kind of neurofeedback is a package. It's not just, what makes it specific beyond, all the other stuff, all the engagement and other stuff that's going on while you're doing the training. But it's everything all together. And then, of course, there are studies with passive control groups where it's much easier to find a difference. And folks say, well, it's just a passive control group. And then that's, pardon the pun, that's a no-brainer, right? So that's another criticism. Then follow-up is key, because studies of neurofeedback show benefit, particularly 6 or more months after the training is complete, after the training course is done. So if you compare, pre and post, and the post is right after, the neurofeedback training course is done, you may not see a benefit. it's really interesting how long after the training you see a benefit with neurofeedback. It can even be as long as I've seen some very new data from Ohio State, from Gene Arnold and his colleagues, showing that, yeah, it can be more than even 2 years after the training is finished.
Wow.
And you'll see a benefit. You'll see a specific benefit for the neurofeedback group. The rule of thumb in the field is to do something like 20 to 40 sessions of about 20 to 30 minutes each. But there are some studies, and we'll see a couple of them, that show in peak performance that even after one session, there's a benefit to the neurofeedback. People will say, well, if it wasn't a minimum of 20 sessions, we can't conclude that the neurofeedback wasn't actually efficacious. And then a couple more, objective outcomes and standalone versus combination. Subjective symptoms are often the most important outcome because you want the individual to feel that they've gotten better subjectively, but they're often criticized as an outcome because the individual is biased. Right? You'd like to believe that you're doing better. So things like a continuous performance task, a CPT, which we're going to talk about in a moment, is considered an objective behavioral measure of performance improvement. And if you have measures of brain activity, which is not usually the case, but if you did, those would also be objective validated outcomes. And then the last thing, the standalone versus combination, has to do with whether the trainee is doing other types of therapy or intervention, whether pharmacologic or non-pharmacologic, together with the neurofeedback. And in the real world, it's sometimes hard to whether it's the neurofeedback that's causing the improvements. All right. So given that e-athlete is interested in peak performance, I took the liberty of pulling what I consider the best, most comprehensive review of optimal or peak performance studies in neurofeedback. This is a study from 2014 from John Griselier. And in that review, he talks about 23 studies in healthy participants that report evidence of neurofeedback learning along with beneficial outcomes. And of those, 7 studies report correlations between neurofeedback learning and outcome gains. So neurofeedback learning in this context means that they were able to improve the trained brainwave, and outcome gains means that they were able to improve in terms of cognitive function or potentially motor skills. And you can see a list there of the types of outcomes that have been linked to successful neurofeedback and peak performance, and it's quite a list. Sustained attention, working memory, mental rotation, motor procedural learning, psychomotor skills, fluid intelligence, and anxiety and performance. And I love this line, from the review. The majority of studies report evidence of neurofeedback learning, and in this respect, the optimal performance field is far ahead of other neurofeedback domains in reporting evidence of learning. So despite the criticisms of neurofeedback research that I talked about a moment ago, in the field of peak performance, there seems to be much more consistent and stronger evidence for the benefit of neurofeedback. Okay, so let's look at I want to look at the studies that where there was a correlation between neurofeedback learning or EEG learning improvement in the brainwave and actual outcome gains. So these are the SMR protocols. Remember, SMR is sort of in the middle of the bands. If you remember that figure that I showed previously, it's what I call the sweet spot of the EEG range, and it's where you're kind of alert but not hyper alert, over aroused. So there's a study from 2001 showing that if you're able to increase your SMR, you actually reduce your impulsive errors on a CPT, on a continuous performance task of sustained attention. Let me take a moment and talk about what a CPT is. CPT is typically used in the context of attentional disorders like ADHD, and it's a task where there's some stimulus, usually visual, but sometimes auditory, and can be both, that is repeatedly presented Every time that stimulus appears, you're to respond as rapidly as possible by touching the screen or pressing a button, except when a particular type of stimulus is shown. So it could be, with color, could be that when a particular color stimulus is shown, you don't respond, but all other colors, are relevant for responses. It could be, as in the case of Myndlift, that the direction that the stimulus is pointing, if it's pointing up, then that's a stimulus not to respond to, but if it's pointing any other direction, you're to respond. So CPTs can give you a measure of impulsivity in the form of commission errors. How often did you respond when you shouldn't have? How often did you respond to that up pointing arrow when you should not have? And they can also give you a measure of inattention, which is how often did you not respond to an arrow pointing a different direction when you should have. It's called an error of omission. So getting back to this 2001 study and looking there at the figure on the right, you can see that there's a relationship, pretty nice relationship, between improving your SMR, increasing your SMR, and changing your commission errors or your impulsivity, improving your impulsivity, reducing the number of errors in this case, if we compare post neurofeedback to pre-neurofeedback. And then in a completely different context, the study from 2019 was a simulated cataract operation. And they showed a correlation between better SMR and reduced pause time between microsurgical tasks in this simulated operation. And then in the last study there from 2013, there was a relationship shown between improving your SMR and memory, as well as sleep quality in terms of sleep spindle frequency. So SMR is very strong in terms of actual cognitive and other, in this case, sleep benefits for peak performance. The other type of neurofeedback protocol that is particularly strong is upper alpha. And here in the top study, that's one of them that was just one session of upper alpha neurofeedback, and the participants were able to improve in a spatial rotation task. And the figure there on the right shows the correlation between those two things. And in 2011, a similar study with a control group that didn't do training, showing improvement in spatial rotation for the upper alpha group, but not for the controls. And then in 2012, a relationship between increasing your upper alpha and improving in working memory in terms of digit span. And digit span is like, if I list off a bunch of digits and I ask you to repeat them to me, how many digits can you successfully repeat? And you can do that either forward in the same direction that I read them to you, or backward, which is a bit harder. It turns out that there's a relationship between improving your upper alpha and both of those. So that's pretty good evidence. And then there are theta uptraining protocols as well. The one from 2009 there is the surgical context. So there were improved microsurgical skills, efficiency, and reduced performance anxiety in a theta alpha ratio protocol. That's actually like the Peniston and Kukalski protocol that I alluded to earlier. So it's actually interesting, it's not just the theta, it's also alpha in this case. And then the last one there is another one session wonder from Reiner and colleagues, 2013, where they found that just one session of uptraining theta led to procedural learning gains after 1, 2, and 6 nights of sleep. But interestingly, not immediately after the training. So that in some way is consistent, I think, with the idea that the benefit from training is kind of delayed. What we spoke about earlier is on a grander scale, where we're talking about the entire training course, and we're seeing that there are benefits, like the biggest benefits are 6 months or more after the training course. But even if we look at the session itself, a single session in this case, what we find is that the benefits may not be immediate. May take 1, 2, or more days after the training to see the benefit. So again, because eAthlete is interested in sports, in this case esports, I pulled this paper, which is a meta-analysis of 10 randomized controlled trials in almost 230 athletes, to look at the benefit of neurofeedback in these folks for sport performance and for EEG power. The bottom line there, it's actually the middle bullet, it's the conclusion of the study, is that there is a significant effect for sport performance. It's a moderate size effect, and there's a significant effect in EEG power. So, like in the previous review, this review or this meta-analysis is looking at not only the ability to improve the brain wave, but also ability to improve real skills, in this case sport performance. So here are the SMR protocols that were included in this meta-analysis, and there are a lot of details that I'm showing here. The electrode sites, CZ or CZ is a central midline site, and C3 is left central, C4 is right central. But the take home here is that in all words, there was improvement, there was significant improvement in that performance, in that particular type of performance, whether it's golf or rifle shooting. There was improvement. There's also the reduced anxiety in the 2012 study, the fourth one down in the swimmers. And in the third one there, it's actually a cognitive benefit, which may be more relevant to eAthlete, right? Because it's gaming. We're actually sitting in a chair and you're not actually moving around. There was an improved tension and reaction time. And what the authors of the review conclude in terms of SMR and why SMR is effective, inhibiting somatosensory and sensory motor processing. And in doing that, conscious processing is reduced and automatic processing is increased, leading to superior sport performance. So you kind of go to automatic mode. You kind of bring yourself into a more automatic pilot mode when you do the SMR enhancement training.
So would you say like the SMR protocol helps, like I guess a big term in sports is getting into the zone. Is that more or less what it helps them to do?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And then here we have the upper alpha studies and theta uptraining studies. Here the evidence was a bit more mixed. So the top 3 studies showed an improvement with uptraining alpha. In the 2014 Griselier study, there was increased cognitive creativity. So there was no improvement in the sport performance, in this case dance, but there was a benefit nonetheless. And perhaps the most interesting study is the last one there, from 2015, in golfers. And what they were trying to do is actually downtrain or inhibit alpha just before the act of putting, because they observed that although upper alpha or increasing alpha is generally adaptive for better sports performance, including golfing, right before you putt, there's actually this drop in alpha. And so they tried to train that drop in alpha, increase that drop in alpha, and maybe then improve putting performance. And they found that they weren't able to improve the putting performance in that way. But there were only 3 training sessions there. So that's like, if you remember the criticisms that I outlined, that's a relatively small number of training sessions. So maybe it just wasn't efficacious. Or we might conclude that neurofeedback works better when it's kind of removed from the actual sport activity. So if you try to do the neurofeedback and then immediately perform that activity, the sport activity, it may not be efficacious. It seems that it's better, as in the case of the other studies, to do the neurofeedback and then at a later point engage in the sporting activity. And the authors account for the benefit of upper alpha by saying that experts show more alpha, which reflects inhibition over task irrelevant brain regions, and lower alpha or less inhibition over the task relevant regions. That's actually what they were trying to do in that last study, is work on that over the task relevant. So it's just a possibility. I don't think that this is necessarily authoritative, but it's interesting. And what we can take home from this meta-analysis is that the evidence for SMR is pretty solid, and from the previous review. The evidence for enhanced upper alpha and theta is less strong, but still there is evidence for benefit. We can see this is just a graphical way of representing the benefit for the studies that were included in the review, and to the studies that are on the right side of the zero are studies where there was a benefit relative to the control condition, and any on the left would be studies where there was no benefit of neurofeedback relative to the control. And what you can see is that both for sport performance at the top and for EEG power at the bottom, all of the studies, with the exception of one or two, the majority of the studies certainly are showing a benefit in favor of neurofeedback. And larger benefit for the sport performance than for the EEG, which at the end of the day is good news, I would say, right? Because that at the end of the day, you're interested in seeing the improvement in your actual performance. So this has to do with the dosage, the question of how many training sessions do I need to do, and if I do more training sessions, do I see more of a benefit? And this is Myndlift data from our database, from real world Myndlift users. It's really a mixed bag. Everybody's in this bag, so it's not just people who are healthy. It's not just people who have a particular diagnosis. It's everybody who are rating symptoms. And if we look at the first symptom rating versus the last rating, and a lower rating is better, by the way, we can see that indeed in more than 830 individuals who were rating symptoms that are related to ADHD, they're labeled here ADHD, but they're attentional symptoms. We can see that there's definitely an improvement for the last rating as compared to the first one, and that the effect size in the middle figure there grows as a function of how many training sessions were completed before that last rating. So that certainly there's an improvement from 10 to 20 to 30, and then maybe 30 and 40 sessions are not really that different overall. And then in the right graph, we can look at individual symptoms. The other two are summaries that incorporate many symptoms. But on the right, we can look at some of the individual symptoms that showed us the largest benefits in the attentional space. And you can see that the effect sizes are sometimes very large. Just as a convention, an effect size of 0.8 or greater is considered a large effect size. So some of the effect sizes there are definitely large. And you can see that they step up so that we see a dosage effect, whereby sometimes you can get a really big jump from 30 to 40 sessions, as in the case of the third symptom, which has to do with hyperfocus. and difficulty switching tasks. This one is similar. It's just anxiety and stress rather than attentional symptoms. Again, there's a benefit. Again, there seems to be a dosage effect. We get more benefit with more training. And again, when we look at the individual symptoms, we see larger effects compared to the overall summaries. Yeah, so I think this is the last slide I've got. And Braden, it's because you had asked me about Gamma.
Yep.
Gamma is not one of the tried and true neurofeedback protocols like SMR or upper alpha, theta alpha. But there have been some studies using gamma neurofeedback. And so I pulled some of those here. The first two from 2010 were able to show that there's a relationship between increasing gamma and intelligence, or measure of what's called premorbid IQ. It's a test called the Raven's Progressive Matrices. And the thing about it is that it's not really specific to the gamma band. That's kind of in line with something I said before, that we often see that the effects of neurofeedback are global. And you may be training gamma, but you generally would see a benefit not only in the gamma, but also in other ranges. And here, gamma is maybe 30 to 40 something hertz. And the benefit here began at 16 hertz, which is well within the beta range. So it's interesting, definitely a benefit in those studies. And and there's also feature binding. The other benefit there is feature binding. So these are tasks where you're asked, in this particular task, you're asked to press an arrow pointing a certain direction. That's location, and then you're asked to remember a particular location of an object and the shape of the object, and then the measures look at how well you're able to combine those various things: shape, location response, meaning direction in this case. And there was a benefit in that type of feature binding task when they were able to increase gamma. And there was also an episodic memory benefit for color in this case. It was a certain type of episodic memory that improved the sort of a deeper type of memory called recollection, but not a simple, not a more shallow type of memory, just whether it's old or new. And then the third one there from 2014 was a sham-controlled study. This was a really good study, and it was looking at perceptual object detection versus spatial attention for a very narrow gamma band, and they demonstrated specificity. So it's known, there's a literature on gamma and binding features of an object that's related to what I did in my graduate work, right? Perceptual object detection. And they found that there was a benefit for that particular type of task when you uptrained gamma, but not another type of task, not a spatial attention task. So those three studies are encouraging, but there's also other work like the study from 2017, where they found that gamma neurofeedback didn't lead to changes in cognitive function or in baseline EEG activity. And they compared it with SMR, right, that tried and true protocol where they did find improved memory and baseline EEG. So there is evidence out there for the efficacy of gamma. It may not be specific, but there's also some evidence on the other side, right, that suggests that maybe gamma isn't that efficacious. So yeah, those are the slides that I prepared. hopefully they were useful, and I'm happy to expand or talk about other things perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. First of all, thank you for going through that entire presentation for what I imagine was the second time. Um, and one thing that stands out to me is specifically SMR training is one that's cited a lot, has been around for a while, and I'm curious why doing SMR training over the motor cortex would lead to things like improved memory, and what the theory behind SMR training over the motor cortex is, and how it leads to general cognitive improvements.
Yeah, so if so SMR is thought to inhibit the sensory motor functions that are localized to the sensory motor strip. So when you uptrain the SMR, what you're doing is you're kind of fine tuning your motor function, so that the motor function that is irrelevant or perhaps as related to the particular task is not as likely to interfere with task performance, and you get cleaner task performance. There's sensory motor activity that can interfere with your ability to perform the task properly.
My other follow-up question for that is, so some of the research I've seen, they will look at the brain waves in someone like putting in golf, and they'll say at this particular moment we see a correlation between high performers with, say, I believe like alpha band, versus low performers don't have the same alpha band's activity. And in those kind of ways of trying to backwards engineer protocols, do you think that is an effective way to find new protocols? Do you think that there's a lot of opportunity to find better protocols for things like performance, or do you think the ones that exist now are kind of the peak and best protocols to use?
Yeah, so I think the safest thing to do is to stick with the ones that have the best evidence,
Mhm.
at least to start with. But you know, there's nothing, there's no reason why one wouldn't try to optimize further. And I think that systems like Myndlift are positioned to enable that type of optimization of protocols, because previously, it wasn't the data just wasn't accessible in the same way that Myndlift has the data accessible to us, so that we can compare variations on protocols in terms of, say, particular bandwidth, certain range of frequencies that are being, say, uptrained, enhanced in one protocol versus another protocol, and look to see potentially, can we get just a bit better performance or a bit better, a bit larger improvement when we make that tweak, that seemingly minor tweak to the frequency band, or to the range of frequencies that's being trained. I don't think there's anything wrong per se with taking a bottom-up approach and kind of looking at what you've got and then saying, hey, that seemed to work best, and then following up on it. But the key is to follow up on it, and then ultimately to do some controlled analyses or controlled studies to convince yourself that it wasn't, just kind of happenstance, right? That you didn't just get a result in your study, and there's nothing systematic. It just kind of happened that way. And of course, having adequate sample size, having a sample size that's representative of the population that you're looking to generalize to are going to be key in helping you avoid those types of errors where you would conclude that it's effective even though it's not.
I think what I'm most curious about there is, I guess, if other researchers were to develop new protocols and if that has potential in the future. And it does sound like there is a possibility for that. But I think I also am in the mindset that I wouldn't want to apply it unless there's enough research, because I think safety is a key. Although that being said, neurofeedback does seem to be a very safe technology. Um,
Absolutely.
uh, the other question that I was curious about, um, is when to train things. So there's a theory, or an idea talked about in just the process of learning and training the brain, whether that's memorization, or in other aspects of brain training, where during the points where things are most difficult, we kind of get the most benefit from training, like with the forgetting curve right before we forget something. If we actively recall it, we learn it better than if we were to recall it right after learning it. And so I was wondering if in some abstract way that would apply to brain training, where something like training for attention would be most beneficial during our lowest points of attention, say mid-afternoon when we're feeling like that afternoon crash. I'm curious what your like personal thoughts might be on something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I could kind of see it going either way. My concern with that type of thing is that you also want the neurofeedback to be uh, um, to be administered, for lack of a better word, at a time when the client is sharp.
Hmm.
You want the brain to be sharp so that it can actually work. If the individual is fatigued, then it's possible, maybe even probable, that the neurofeedback might not be as efficacious. So I understand what you're suggesting, and there is a logic to it that you want to kind of catch the client at that point where they're having difficulty. But my if the purpose was to maximize chance of efficacy, I think I would go for the other approach and do the neurofeedback when they're not how do you say, when they're not kind of crunched. That we didn't talk about thresholds at all,
Right.
but the neurofeedback is inherently designed so that it's challenging for the client at the right level, depending upon how the client's doing. And so, um, it seems to me that, if they're doing the neurofeedback and they're progressing, so that they're being adequately challenged and they're getting their positive feedback and their positive reinforcement, and perhaps the threshold may change eventually because they'll be doing so well. Then that's key. That's the flexing, if you want, or that's the toning, right, of the brain muscle in so to speak, that we'd be looking for to see the maximum benefit from the neurofeedback.
That does make a lot of sense. Yes. Um, the only other question that I'd be curious to ask about next is what your personal goals are for the future. Like, what kind of things are you working on at Myndlift? What kind of things are you hoping to work on at Myndlift, and what do you see for the future?
Yeah. So there's a lot.
Cool.
I mean, one thing is the assessment. I don't know if you've had a chance to check out our assessment tool. It's currently in beta.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so there's a lot of work around that. Very often in studies of neurofeedback, it's the resting EEG that's used to demonstrate the benefit in terms of the EEG. And other ways to look at it are, take the first and last training session, say, and compare them. But it's much better to have the resting EEG. And in the field of neurotherapy, in the clinics, folks are used to having either a full EEG or a QEEG, a quantitative EEG, prior to starting the neurofeedback, and then post neurofeedback, so they can look at the changes kind of over the entire brain as a result of the neurofeedback, and it allows the neurotherapist or the neurofeedback clinician to customize the neurofeedback protocol based on the particular pattern of brain activity, or status, if you will, of the brain activity prior to the neurofeedback training, and also during the course of the training. So we're as I say, this is in beta, and we're just at this point we're collecting data, and we're looking at the reliability of the measurements, and eventually we're gonna have enough confidence in this in the data that it's going to be released as a full release, and it's got components in addition to the EEG, like a continuous performance task, and most recently, validated symptoms questionnaires, validated subjective symptoms questionnaires for a variety of different types of symptoms, whether depressive or anxiety related, or addiction, all of these types of things. And all of this is wrapped into the assessment, and it's going to give us the ability to look at the efficacy of neurofeedback and different protocols and so on in a way that just wasn't possible before, in a much more detailed way. And so that's a lot of what I see going forward. There's also the personalized aspect. We didn't really talk about that much, but in addition to personalizing the neurofeedback protocol for the individual, say based on the assessment, there's also the question of whether the bands that you train are fixed or personalized for the client. And most commonly, this is done in the context of upper alpha training. And the way it's done is that the clinician or the researcher will find the frequency of the peak of the alpha wave, individualized peak alpha. And then based on that, individualized bands will be set for the client. You kind of map out from that anchor point, the different bands. And what's been shown in many studies is that the efficacy of neurofeedback is greater when the bands are personalized in this way as compared to when they're fixed, even though fixed bands are also very good. So one of the things that I'm working on now is adding this functionality to Myndlift, so that in the future, users will be able to decide if they want to use fixed bands or if they'd like to use the personalized bands anchored to the individual alpha peak. So that's another exciting direction. And more generally, Myndlift is looking to branch out and complement the neurofeedback with some other, potentially with some other interventions. So I'm working on that as well. The most prominent is some form of CBT-based intervention, cognitive behavioral therapy-based intervention. And it's known that CBT is the most well-established and efficacious intervention for anxiety in particular. And given what's going on in the world right now. I think there's an article I read that something like 70% of Americans have significant anxiety now due to the pandemic. The need for an intervention, for interventions that are efficacious in addressing particularly anxiety symptoms is great. And ultimately, we'll look at combining these types of interventions, the cognitive behavioral therapy with the neurofeedback that we've got, and see if we can get some even better um, um, improvement. So these are just some of the things really that we're working on. We're interested also in optimizing. We talked a little bit about the different bands and so on, and we're also looking at what makes a person a responder. What are the characteristics of an EEG responder, or if we have performance measures like a CPT? What makes a person a CPT responder versus a non-responder, and then ultimately the question would be, how can we make a non-responder a responder?
Mm.
That's that would be the so to speak, the holy grail. But that's down the road. There's just a lot of work to be done. So yeah.
It's very cool. It's very cool to hear. I guess one last final question, a little different than the past one. There was I guess what you think is the general potential for esports for this application. Just thinking of it as a performance tool, I think a lot of people who are just getting introduced to this and are serious about competing, whether they're already making money within their career in esports or they're at that level and they're about to, like what would you say to them is the potential benefit or a reason to try neurofeedback?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the points that I touched on in the presentation are relevant. Neurofeedback, has the potential to put your brain in a more adaptive state, from the cellular level up through the network level and multi-network, the way that networks of neurons interact with one another. It's potentially very, very powerful, and that's an edge, that's an advantage that an esport athlete would have, if they engaged in neurofeedback over others. And I also think that the evidence that I've shared is quite solid and quite encouraging. There was that conclusion from the Griselier review, that really the majority of studies in peak performance are showing a benefit for neurofeedback, and that's not the case in other more clinically oriented applications of neurofeedback. So if I were an esport athlete, I'd consider those points, and I would say, wow, this this could really make the difference for me, in terms of competing at a higher level and potentially making it more lucrative for me.
Awesome. I think that wraps it up perfectly. So I just want to thank you so much for your time. I know this went over the time we had kind of allotted for this, so I really appreciate that. Thank you for even
No
telling me a bit
problem.
about your career. I think that was kind of inspiring as someone who's really interested in neuroscience. So overall, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for teaching me and everyone who will see clips from this.
No problem. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and this is really an exciting avenue, the esport application. And I wish you all the best of luck, with eAthlete and all of the clients who will hopefully be able to benefit from your programs and the neurofeedback that you'll incorporate.
So I hope you guys learned a ton in this conversation. I hope it was interesting and inspiring. I hope you now all become neuroscientists. And I hope you're interested in neurofeedback. Quite honestly, neurofeedback used to be something that was insanely expensive for someone who just wants to improve their brain power to perform. Let's say you were a professional basketball player and you wanted to improve your focusing ability. You might then go ahead and spend $5,000 to $10,000 on a 3-month training session where you train every single day. And quite honestly, for someone who's a professional, that kind of money makes sense, especially when it comes to your career, which you're going to make more money from. Nowadays, due to Myndlift and the EEG technology that they use, they're basically able to cut that price down to a fraction of what it used to be. Now, that being said, it's still admittedly quite expensive for just the average amateur who wants to improve their brain power. But for someone who's a semi-pro or professional player who's genuinely trying to make a career out of esports, I do recommend checking out Neurofeedback. If it's something that you can get now, that's pretty awesome. The sooner you can hop on it, the bigger the advantage you'll have over other people. But even if it's just a future endeavor, I highly recommend looking into it. And at the very least, if you get nothing else from this conversation in this video, I hope you're inspired to learn more about how the brain works and how we might be able to improve it. Because neurofeedback is just one of many ways we can boost our brains. And so I hope that you're excited to try out everything else that comes from it. And of course, just an extra reminder, don't forget to like and comment on this video. Let me know your thoughts on it because I'd love to hear from you guys. And nonetheless, thank you guys for watching the video. Keep on grinding, and I'll see you all in the next video.